The Approach to Al-Muttasim. Philip Guedala writes that the novel The Approach to Al-Muttasim by the Bombay attorney Mir Bahadur Ali is a rather uncomfortable amalgam of one of those Islamic allegorical poems that seldom fail to interest their translator, and one of those detective novels that inevitably surpass John H. Watson's and perfect the horror of life in the most irreproachable rooming houses of Brighton. Earlier, Mr. Cecil Roberts had detected in Bahadur's book the usual and implausible influence of Wilkie Collins and the illustrious 12th century Persian poet Farid al-Din Attar. The none-too-original Guedala repeats this calm observation, though in choleric accents. In essence, the two critics concur. Both point out the detective mechanism of the novel, and both speak of its mystical undercurrents. That hybridity may inspire us to imagine some similarity to Chesterton. We shall soon discover that no such similarity exists. The first edition of The Approach to Al-Muttasim appeared in Bombay in late 1932. Its paper was virtually newsprint. Its cover announced to the buyer that this was the first detective novel written by a native of Bombay City. Within months, readers had bought out 4 printings of 1,000 copies each. The Bombay Quarterly Review, the Bombay Gazette, the Calcutta Review, the Hindustan Review of Allahabad, and the Calcutta Englishman rained dithyrambs upon it. It was then that Bahadur published an illustrated edition he titled The Conversation with a Man Called Al-Muttasim, and coyly subtitled A Game with Shifting Mirrors. That edition has just been reprinted in London by Victor Gollancz, with a foreword by Dorothy L. Sayers, but with the perhaps merciful omission of the illustrations. I have that book before me. I have not been able to come upon the first, which I suspect is greatly superior. I am supported in this conclusion by an appendix that details the fundamental difference between the original 1932 version and the edition of 1934. Before examining the work and discussing it, I think it would be a good idea to give a brief general outline of the novel. Its visible protagonist, whose name we are never told, is a law student in Bombay. In the most blasphemous way, he has renounced the Islamic faith of his parents, but as the 10th night of the moon of Muharram wanes, he finds himself at the center of a riot, a street battle between Muslims and Hindus. It is a night of tambours and invocations. Through the inimical multitude, the great paper baldachins of the Muslim procession make their way. A Hindu brick flies from a rooftop nearby. Someone buries a dagger in a belly. Someone, a Muslim, a Hindu, dies and is trampled underfoot. 3,000 men do battle, cane against revolver, obscenity against imprecation, God the Indivisible against the gods. In a sort of daze, the free-thinking law student enters the fray. With desperate hands, he kills, or thinks he has killed, a Hindu. Thundering, horse-born, half asleep, the Sirkar police intervene with impartial lashes of their crops. Virtually under the hooves of the horses, the student makes his escape, fleeing toward the outermost suburbs of the city. He crosses 2 railroad tracks, or twice crosses the same track. He scales the wall of an unkempt garden, which has a circular tower toward the rear. A lean and evil mob of moon-colored hounds emerges from the black rose bushes. Fearing for his life, the student seeks refuge in the tower. He climbs an iron ladder, some rungs are missing, and on the flat roof, which has a pitch-black hole in the center, he comes upon a filthy man squatting in the moonlight, pouring forth a vigorous stream of urine. This man confides to the law student that it is his profession to steal the gold teeth from the cadavers the Farsis bring, swaddled in white, to that tower. He makes several further gruesome remarks, and then he mentions that it has been 14 nights since he purified himself with ox dung. He speaks with obvious anger about certain Gujarati horse thieves, eaters of dog meat and lizard meat, men, in a word, as vile as you and I. The sky is growing light. There is a lowering circle of fat vultures in the air. The law student, exhausted, falls asleep. When he awakens, the sun now high, the thief has disappeared. A couple of cigarettes from Trichinopolis have also disappeared, as have a few silver rupees. In the face of the menace that looms from the previous night, the law student decides to lose himself in India. He reflects that he has shown himself capable of killing an idolater, yet incapable of knowing with any certainty whether the Muslim possesses more of truth than the idolater does. The name Gujarat has remained with him, as has that of Amalka Sansi, a woman in the caste of thieves in Palanpur, a woman favored by the imprecations and hatred of the corpse robber. The law student reasons that the wrath and hatred of a man so thoroughly despicable is the equivalent of a hymn of praise. He resolves, therefore, though with little hope, to find this woman. He performs his prayers, and then he sets out with sure, slow steps on the long path. That brings the reader to the end of the second chapter of the book. It would be impossible to trace the adventures of the remaining 19 chapters. There is a dizzying pullulation of dramatis personae, not to mention a biography that seems to catalogue every motion of the human spirit, from iniquity to mathematical speculation, and a pilgrimage that covers the vast geography of Hindustan. The story, begun in Bombay, continues in the lowlands of Palanpur, pauses for a night and a day at the stone gate of Bikaner, narrates the death of a blind astrologer in a cesspool in Benares, conspires in the multiform palace at Kathmandu, prays and fornicates in the pestilential stench of the Machua Bazaar in Calcutta, watches the day being born out of the sea from a scribe's stool in Madras, watches the evening decline into the sea from a balcony in the state of Travancore, gutters and dies in Hindapur, and closes its circle of leagues and years in Bombay again, a few steps from the garden of those moon-coloured hounds. The plot itself is this. A man, the unbelieving, fleeing law student we have met, falls among people of the lowest, vilest sort and accommodates himself to them in a kind of contest of iniquity. Suddenly, with the miraculous shock of Crusoe, when he sees that human footprint in the sand, the law student perceives some mitigation of the evil, a moment of tenderness, of exaltation, of silence in one of the abominable men. It was as though a more complex interlocutor had spoken. He knows that the wretch with whom he is conversing is incapable of that momentary decency. Thus, that the law student hypothesizes that the vile man before him has reflected a friend, or the friend of a friend. Rethinking the problem, he comes to a mysterious conclusion. Somewhere in the world, there is a man from whom this clarity, this brightness emanates. Somewhere in the world, there is a man who is equal to this brightness. The law student resolves to devote his life to searching out that man. Thus we begin to see the book's general scheme, the insatiable search for a soul by means of the delicate glimmerings or reflections this soul has left in others. At first, the faint trace of a smile or a word; toward the last, the varied and glowing splendors of intelligence, imagination, and goodness. The more closely the men interrogated by the law student have known Al-Mutasim, the greater is their portion of divinity, but the reader knows that they themselves are but mirrors. A technical mathematical formula is applicable here. Bahadur's heavily frightened novel is an ascending progression whose final term is the sensed, or foreapprehended, man called Al-Muhtasim. The person immediately preceding Al-Muhtasim is a Persian bookseller of great courtesy and felicity. The man preceding the bookseller is a saint. After all those years, the law student comes to a gallery, at the end of which there is a doorway and a tawdry curtain of many beads, and behind that a glowing light. The law student claps his hands once, twice, and calls out for Al-Muhtasim. A man's voice, the incredible voice of Al-Muhtasim, bids the law student enter. The law student draws back the bead curtain and steps into the room. At that point, the novel ends. I believe I am correct in saying that if an author is to pull off such a plot, he is under two obligations. First, he must invent a variety of prophetic signs. Second, he must not allow the hero, prefigured by those signs, to become a mere phantasm or convention. Bahadur meets the first obligation. I am not sure to what extent he meets the second. In other words, the unheard and unseen Al-Muhtasim should impress us as being a real person, not some jumble of vapid superlatives. In the 1932 version of the novel, the supernatural notes are few and far between. The man called Al-Muhtasim has his touch of symbolism, but he possesses idiosyncratic personal traits as well. Unfortunately, that commendable literary practice was not to be followed in the second edition. In the 1934 version, the edition I have before me even now, the novel sinks into allegory. Al-Muhtasim is an emblem of God, and the detailed itineraries of the hero are somehow the progress of the soul in its ascent to mystical plenitude. These are distressing details. A black Jew from Cochin, describing Al-Muhtasim, says that his skin is dark. A Christian says that he stands upon a tower with his arms outspread. A red llama recalls him as seated like that image which I carved from Yakhi and worshipped in a monastery at Tashelhumpo. Those declarations are an attempt to suggest a single, unitary God who molds himself to the dissimilarities of humankind. In my view, that notion is not particularly exciting. I cannot say the same for another idea, however, the idea that the Almighty is also in search of someone, and that someone in search of a yet superior, or perhaps simply necessary, albeit equal, someone, and so on, to the end, or, better yet, the endlessness of time, or perhaps, cyclically. The etymological meaning of Al-Muhtasim, the name of that 8th Abbasid king who won 8 battles, engendered 8 sons and 8 daughters, left 8,000 slaves, and reigned for a period of 8 years, 8 moons, and 8 days, is he who goes in quest of aid. In the 1932 version of the novel, the fact that the object of the pilgrimage was himself a pilgrim cleverly justified the difficulty of finding Al-Muhtasim. In the 1934 edition, that fact leads to the extravagant theology I have described. Mir Bahadur Ali, as we have seen, is incapable of resisting that basest of art's temptations, the temptation to be a genius. I reread what I have just written, and I fear I have not made sufficiently explicit the virtues of this book. It has some quite civilized features. For example, the argument in Chapter 19, in which the law student and the reader sense that one of the participants in the debate is a friend of Al-Muhtasim. The man does not rebut another man's sophisms in order not to gloat at the other man's defeat. It is generally understood that a modern-day book may honorably be based upon an older one, especially since, as Dr. Johnson observed, no man likes owing anything to his contemporaries. The repeated, but irrelevant, points of congruence between Joyce's Ulysses and Homer's Odyssey continue to attract, though I shall never understand why, the dazzled admiration of critics. The points of congruence between Bahadur's novel and Farid al-Din Attar's classic Conference of the Birds meets with the no less mysterious praise of London and even of Allahabad and Calcutta. There are other debts as well. One investigator has documented certain analogies between the first scene of the novel and Kipling's story On the City Wall. Bahadur acknowledges these echoes, but claims that it would be most unusual if 2 portraits of the 10th night of Muharram should not agree. With greater justice, Eliot recalls that never once in the 70 cantos of Spenser's unfinished allegory, The Fairy Queen, does the heroine Gloriana appear, an omission for which Richard William Church had criticized the work. I myself, in all humility, would point out a distant, possible precursor, the Kabbalist Isaac Luria, who, in Jerusalem, in the 16th century, revealed that the soul of an ancestor or teacher may enter into the soul of an unhappy or unfortunate man to comfort or instruct him. That type of metempsychosis is called ibur. In the course of this article, I have referred to the Mantak al-Tatar, or conference, perhaps parliament, of the birds by the Persian mystic poet Farid al-Din Abi Hamid Muhammad ben Ibrahim, known as Attar, or perfumer, who was murdered by the soldiers under Tului, the son of Genghis Khan, where Nishapur was sacked. Perhaps I should summarize that poem. One of the splendid feathers of the distant king of the birds, the simurgh, falls into the center of China. Other birds, weary with the present state of anarchy, resolve to find this king. They know that the name of their king means 30 birds. They know that his palace is in the mountains of Kaf, the mountains that encircle the earth. The birds undertake the almost infinite adventure. They cross 7 wadis, or 7 seas. The penultimate of these is called vertigo, the last annihilation. Many of the pilgrims abandon the quest. Others perish on the journey. At the end, 30 birds, purified by their travails, come to the mountain on which the simurgh lives, and they look upon their king at last. They see that they are the simurgh, and that the simurgh is each and all of them. Plotinus, too, in the Enneads 5:8-4, remarks upon a paradisal extension of the principle of identity. Everything in the intelligible heavens is everywhere. Anything is all things. The sun is all stars, and each star is all stars, and the sun. The Mantak al-Tayr has been translated into French by Garcind Tassi, into English by Edward Fitzgerald. For this note, I have consulted Richard Burton's 1001 Nights, Volume 10, and the Margaret Smith study, entitled The Persian Mystics, Attar, 1932. The parallels between this poem and Mir Bahadur Ali's novel are not overdone. In chapter 20, a few words attributed by a Persian bookseller to Al-Mutasim are perhaps an expansion of words spoken by the hero. That and other ambiguous similarities may signal the identity of the seeker and the sought. They may also signal that the sought has already influenced the seeker. Another chapter suggests that Al-Mutasim is the Hindu that the law student thinks he murdered.